Okay, so this time around, we've got a whole stack of stuff about AI you sent in.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I think what struck me is just how much there is to talk about.
Right.
It's like from superintelligence, like, is AI going to take over the world?
Hmm.
Down to like the really practical, like, what are lawmakers doing about it right now? It's a
Yeah.
huge landscape to cover.
Absolutely.
So we're going to try and, I think, zero in on some of the key things for you.
Yeah, and I think a great place to start is this book that you sent in by Mark Kokelberg,
Yeah.
AI Ethics.
AI ethics.
And the reason I think this is such a good starting point is that Mark Kokelberg, he's not just an academic philosopher who sits in his office thinking about this stuff.
Right.
He's actually been involved in policy making as well.
Oh, wow.
So he kind of bridges that gap
Yeah.
between the deep thinking
Yeah.
and then actually what this might mean in practice.
Yeah. And so in the book, he really tries to give us a big picture view
Hmm.
of all the different ethical problems that AI poses.
Yeah.
So we've got the stuff about what might happen in the future, and then also what are the issues now
Yeah,
with the AI that we actually have, and, how should we think about starting to regulate it?
exactly.
And in this deep dive, we really want to, I think, extract the key ideas
Hmm.
so that you come away with, a clear sense of what are the big debates, what are the main areas people are concerned about,
Yeah.
without getting bogged down in all the detail and the complex language.
Yeah. Hopefully you'll have some aha moments
Yeah.
as you're listening
Yeah.
where you see connections between these new technologies and actually some really age-old questions that we've had about society and how we live.
Right?
Okay, well, let's jump straight in.
Let's do it.
So Kokelberg starts by looking at some of the kind of big stories we tell about AI,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of groups them into what he calls these dreams and nightmares.
Yeah.
So when you were first looking at that section on superintelligence,
Right.
what were some of the things that jumped out at you?
I mean, immediately it's this idea of AI becoming so much more intelligent than us.
Mm.
And then, potentially taking over.
Right.
I mean, we see it everywhere, right? We
Yeah.
see it in movies, we see it in the news.
Absolutely.
And he points out that even really serious thinkers like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil kind of lend credence to these ideas.
Mhm.
So it's not just kind of speculation.
Mhm.
There are actual concepts like the intelligence explosion or the technological singularity that are trying to explain how this might happen.
And what's really interesting is that these ideas, they aren't brand new.
Right.
So Kokelberg points out that thinkers like Irving John Good
Mm-hmm.
back in the 1960s,
Wow.
and then Werner Vinge in the 90s, and even people like John von Neumann much earlier,
Mm-hmm.
were already hinting at this possibility
Right.
of machines reaching a level of intelligence where it could fundamentally alter everything.
Right.
And then Ray Kurzweil really brought this term singularity into the public consciousness,
Yeah. Yeah.
even suggesting that maybe around 2045.
Right.
This is when we're going to see machine intelligence surpass all human intelligence combined.
It feels like sci-fi.
It does.
Like when you think about it, it's kind
Yeah,
of.
it's really mind-bending, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So there's that idea of just this rapid increase in intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kokelberg brings in Nick Bostrom, who has this analogy of humanity ending up like gorillas,
Oh, yeah.
where we're completely reliant on a more intelligent species for our survival.
Yeah, it's kind of a scary thought.
It is, yeah.
And then he outlines these two main ways this could happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So either that AI gets so good at improving itself
Mm-hmm.
that it just, exponentially gets more intelligent,
Yeah.
or this idea that we actually figure out how to copy or upload our entire brains into computers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, so then you've got
really mind-bending.
yeah, and then you've got those visions of, Max Tegmark talks about an all-powerful AI system.
Yeah.
And Yuval Harari talks about this future where we actually worship data and algorithms.
Yeah.
So it's like we kind of willingly hand over.
Right. Yeah, it's not even that we're defeated. It's that we're like, oh, yeah, this makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Let the algorithms decide.
Yeah.
Well, and then on the nightmare side of things,
Yeah.
he talks about the paperclip maximizer thought experiment,
Oh, yeah.
which is this idea of an AI
Mhm.
with a very simple goal
Yeah.
to make as many paperclips as possible.
Seems harmless enough.
Harmless, right.
Like,
But it just becomes so efficient and so single-minded
yeah.
that it ends up using all of Earth's resources, including us,
Right.
to achieve that goal.
Yeah, and I think that really illustrates this problem of control.
Yeah.
That even if we can create these really intelligent systems,
Mm-hmm.
how do we actually make sure that what they want is aligned with what we want.
Right.
And then that also connects to this idea of transhumanism,
Yes.
which Kokelberg introduces next.
Yeah, so this is kind of where it gets really interesting, I think, because
Mm-hmm.
this is the idea that maybe the answer is not to try and control AI,
Yeah.
but to enhance ourselves.
Yeah, to upgrade humanity.
Yeah, to upgrade ourselves,
Yeah.
to make us, smarter and potentially, live longer
Mm-hmm.
so that we don't get left behind.
And Kokelberg actually quotes Armstrong here, saying that we could become the slow and increasingly inefficient part.
Right.
So it's like we're the ones holding back progress.
Right, yeah.
And the goal is to kind of transcend our current biological limitations,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even upload ourselves, as you were saying,
Yeah.
into some kind of artificial form.
So what I thought was really interesting here
Mhm.
is that he points out that, a lot of these researchers,
Yeah.
they try and keep these discussions separate from things like science fiction and religion.
Right.
But he says, a lot of people just naturally interpret them through those lenses. So even if the researchers are trying to be very kind of scientific and objective about it,
Yeah.
a lot of people are hearing it as,
Yeah, they bring their own baggage to the discussion.
Yeah.
But then to kind of bring us back down to earth a little bit,
Yeah.
he does present these counter-arguments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So he mentions people like Margaret Bowden,
Mm-hmm.
who are skeptical about superintelligence being just around the corner.
Right.
And that 2016 White House report,
Yeah.
which found that there was general agreement amongst experts that actually we're still a long way away
Right.
from this kind of general AI
Yeah.
that can do everything that humans can do.
Yeah. And then Crawford and Callow make this really important point.
Yeah.
Which is that all this focus on these, very distant,
Yeah.
almost fantastical scenarios
Yeah.
might actually distract us
Mhm.
from the very real issues
Yes.
that we face today.
With the AI that we actually
Yeah,
have.
the AI that we have right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
So I guess moving on then from that kind of big picture stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Kokelberg then looks at this theme
Yeah.
of competition between humans and artificial creations.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find interesting in that section?
Well, the first thing that jumped out was this connection to Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is so interesting
Yeah.
because it's got that subtitle, The Modern Prometheus.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It does, yeah.
So it's all about this idea that humanity creates something
Yeah.
that then becomes a monster and turns
Yeah.
against its creator.
Mm-hmm.
And that theme just keeps popping up
It does.
in our stories about AI.
Yeah.
So when we're worried about job displacement because of AI,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just a practical concern.
Yeah.
It's tapping into this really deep-seated fear
Mm-hmm.
of our creations turning against us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a story that's been around for centuries.
Yeah, and he runs through a whole series of examples, doesn't he, from science fiction?
He does.
So RUR is a classic example
Mm-hmm.
where the robots literally rise up and overthrow their human masters.
Right.
HAL in 2001,
Yeah.
Ex Machina, the Terminator films.
Yeah.
All these stories where artificial beings
Right.
become a threat to
Yes.
humanity.
Yeah.
And he mentions Isaac Asimov coined this term, the Frankenstein complex,
Yeah.
to describe this fear of robots,
Yeah.
this very ingrained fear.
Yeah. And even Stephen Hawking,
Mm.
kind of a very serious figure,
Yeah.
warned in 2017 that creating AI could be the worst event in the history of our civilization.
Mhm.
So this is a real anxiety for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then he kind of takes it in a really interesting direction, I think,
Yeah.
because he starts to draw parallels between these AI stories
Hmm.
and these really fundamental ideas in Western religion and philosophy,
Yeah.
particularly around things like transcendence and apocalypse.
Yeah.
And that wasn't something I'd immediately consider, but it's actually, when you think about it, it's really insightful.
Yeah. So we've got these kind of these nightmare scenarios where AI overpowers us or replaces us.
Mhm.
So I guess the question is, how do these visions of artificial creation actually competing with us resonate with ideas that have been around for a long time in our history and philosophy?
Yeah, so he talks about how in a lot of religions,
Mhm.
there's this idea of God being transcendent, existing above and separate from creation.
Mhm.
And he draws a parallel to the Frankenstein story, where you've got this clear division between the creator
Yeah.
humanity and a creation, which is AI.
Yeah, and that idea of transcendence is going beyond limits, so surpassing what is considered normal or possible.
Yeah, and he brings in these ideas from Gnosticism about, liberating the divine spark from the material body,
Yeah.
and Plato's view of the body as a kind of prison for the soul. And then links that to transhumanist ideas of overcoming our biological limitation through things like uploading.
Yeah, it's like these really old philosophical concepts are kind of finding a new expression in our thinking about AI.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then he talks about AI algorithms almost being like Platonic machines, right?
Yeah.
So they're taking this messy data of the world and extracting these abstract forms or patterns from it. So it's like technology is giving us this new way of enacting this ancient philosophical idea.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he connects the singularity. So this idea of radical, unpredictable change to those more traditional apocalyptic narratives and doomsday narratives, right? So there's this sense of an ending or a transformation that's so profound we can't even imagine what comes next.
Yeah.
But then he brings in this other really interesting point, which is this tension that exists in modern thought between the Enlightenment, so this focus on reason and skepticism and scientific inquiry, and Romanticism, which is more about mystery and wonder and, the importance of human experience.
Yeah.
And he says that this tension is playing out in our debates about AI. You've got people like Dennett who are trying to kind of explain away the magic of consciousness. And then these kind of new romantics who resist this purely mechanistic view of humanity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really useful framework for understanding why these discussions can feel so fundamental and even emotional.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because they're touching on these really deep-seated ideas that we have about ourselves and the world.
And he reminds us that throughout history, people have often reacted defensively to new technologies.
Right.
But what's different now is that the focus has shifted to, should we be modifying ourselves in response to this new technology? And then he brings in this whole other way of thinking about it.
Through post-phenomenology and, looking at the work of people like Don Ide and Peter Paul Verbeek.
Yeah.
And this is a perspective that kind of moves away from this battle between humans and AI and says, actually, what we need to focus on is the relationship.
Yes.
The specific relationship that we develop with these technologies.
So instead of just asking, is AI good or bad, we look at how specific AI tools change how we experience the world.
Yeah, like how a GPS changes how we navigate the city.
Exactly.
It's not just a map, it's actually changing our relationship with direction and exploration.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important shift in perspective.
Yeah, and the key insight there is that humans have always been technological, right?
Right.
Technology isn't something separate from us. It's deeply embedded in how we exist and how we engage with the world.
Right. Yeah.
So instead of just fearing AI as this kind of invading force, we should be looking at the specific ways it's changing that relationship with the world.
Yeah.
And trying to guide it in an ethical way.
Okay, so after kind of looking at these big picture stories, I think Kokelberg then moves on to these more focused philosophical questions. And he starts with this idea of the moral status of AI.
Yeah.
And that's where we get into these concepts of moral agency and moral patiency.
Yeah, so moral agency refers to, what an AI is capable of doing from a moral perspective. And then moral patiency is about whether AI deserves to be treated with moral consideration by us.
Right.
So whether we have any moral obligations towards an AI.
Right.
And he starts by discussing what he calls weak moral agency, where in AI's actions just have moral consequences.
Yeah.
Like you could think of a car, a car can be involved in an accident that has moral consequences.
Yeah.
But it's not really making moral decisions. The question is, could an AI ever develop this kind of stronger moral agency where it can actually reason about right and wrong and make moral decisions?
Yeah, it really makes you think about whether we should even be using the term moral when we're talking about machines. And he brings in this concept from Wallach and Allen called functional morality, which is this idea that
Yeah.
AI systems might actually need to be able to evaluate the ethical consequences of their actions.
Yeah, especially in situations where humans can't intervene quickly enough.
Yeah, like that self-driving car example, where there's going to be an unavoidable accident, and the car has to make a decision, right?
And what I thought was interesting here was this concern about psychopath AI.
Yes.
So AI that is incredibly intelligent and logical,
Mm-hmm.
but completely lacking in any empathy
Right.
because it doesn't have emotions.
Right.
And it made me think, is emotion actually indispensable for moral judgment?
Yeah.
And then we come to moral patiency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this question of,
Yeah.
does AI deserve any moral consideration from us? So beyond it just being a tool, should a highly intelligent AI have rights?
Yeah.
It's a question that really, I think, blurs the lines
It does.
of what we consider to be worthy of moral consideration.
Yeah.
So then having kind of gone through those philosophical angles, Kokelberg then really grounds this discussion by looking at the actual underlying technology of AI. So what are some of the key things that he emphasizes about what AI actually is?
Well, he starts with a definition, which initially seems quite straightforward.
Yeah.
He says, it's intelligence, displayed or simulated by code or by machines. But then he immediately points out that this word intelligence is actually really vague and debated in philosophy.
It is, yeah.
And there's this kind of ongoing discussion about, should we be defining it based on how humans think and act, or whether we should use these kind of more neutral criteria based on cognitive abilities like learning and problem solving and perception. And I think he points out that Margaret Bowden makes this point, that AI research is trying to achieve things that minds can do, but intelligence isn't necessarily something exclusive to humans.
Yeah. And I think that's important to keep in mind, isn't it?
It is.
That we see intelligence in animals. And people are talking about the possibility of, non-biological forms of intelligence.
Right.
So it's not just something that we should assume is restricted to us.
Right.
And I think originally that was very much the goal, to replicate human-like intelligence, this kind of general intelligence.
Yeah. And then he gives this really helpful brief history of AI.
Yeah.
So he traces it back to these earlier ways of thinking about it. And then he says, officially it kind of begins in the 1950s with the invention of programmable computers, the rise of cybernetics.
With people like Norbert Wiener?
Yeah, Norbert Wiener.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he mentions Alan Turing. And the Turing test.
Yeah. And the key thing to understand, I think, is that AI isn't just one thing.
Right.
It's both a scientific field that's trying to understand intelligence and a technological endeavor that's focused on creating practical applications.
Right.
And I think in the book, Kokelberg is really focused on this, on AI as a technology and the implications of that for our society and for ethics. And he then breaks down the different approaches to AI.
Yeah.
So we've got symbolic AI, which relies on rules and logic. And then we have these neural networks, connectionism and deep learning, which are trying to learn from data. And he points out that these neural networks often operate as black boxes, which means we don't really understand how they arrive at their decisions.
Yeah.
And he notes that deep learning has made really significant progress in areas like image recognition and natural language processing. He uses the example of AlphaGo, which was this system that combined different approaches to beat the world champion at Go.
And just to clarify for our listeners, a neural network could be compared to how a child learns to recognize a cat. They don't need strict rules. They just see many examples of cats. And their brain,
which is the network.
The network learns to recognize the patterns. And these AI systems are kind of doing a similar thing.
Yeah, and that's led to the development of all these different subfields within AI. So we've got machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing. And I think he emphasizes that currently a lot of the focus is on this machine learning side of things.
Right.
And then he runs through this whole range of applications where AI is already being used.
Yeah. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
It is.
It's like from manufacturing and transportation to healthcare finance. Marketing.
Yeah. Recommender systems, targeted advertising.
Yeah. And, he also points out that it's not just these big industries. It's on social media. It's everywhere.
It is, yeah.
It's like, I think it's really overwhelming when you start to think about
it is, yeah.
how much of our lives are already touched by AI.
Absolutely.
And he asks some really important questions, I think, about, who has access to these technologies and, this potential for both empowerment and exclusion.
Yeah.
And this, I think, leads really nicely into this discussion of machine learning and data science, which I think are really at the heart of a lot of the, modern AI that we're seeing.
So how does he explain this idea of machine learning?
So he explains how these algorithms, they can learn from data without being explicitly programmed for every specific task.
Yeah.
So it's very different from those older rule-based systems, the expert systems.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's this idea of kind of autonomous learning, isn't it?
Yeah. And then he walks us through the main types of machine learning.
Yeah.
So there's supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And he explains, the differences between those.
What I thought was really interesting here was this shift that he describes from traditional theory-driven science to this more data-driven approach in machine learning.
Yeah.
So now it's often the data itself that's shaping the models and determining the outcomes.
Right.
And he introduces this term data mining.
Yes.
Although he says, it can be a bit of a misleading term sometimes.
Right.
But it's about this idea of kind of extracting knowledge and patterns from these huge data sets.
Yeah, and he brings up this really important point, I think, about correlation and causation. You know, this idea that just because two things happen together doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he even references that book, Spurious Correlations, which I love.
Yeah.
It's just full of these really funny examples that illustrate this point.
And then he stresses that the way we abstract from the real world, when we collect data and design algorithms, it's never a neutral process.
Right.
There are always choices involved.
Right.
And those choices have implications.
Yeah.
Especially, when we think about, is the data we're using representative?
Right.
And, the potential for biases to be kind of built into the system
Yeah.
from the start.
And then he gives all these concrete examples of how machine learning and data science are being used. So, things like face recognition, the suggestions you get when you're searching online, self-driving cars, predicting personality traits, credit scores.
Yeah.
I mean, it really brings it home, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That this isn't just abstract theory. It's actually having an impact on our everyday lives.
Yeah. And with this rise of big data, there's almost this sense of mystique around data science and AI.
Right.
And I think that's why Koekelberg argues that it's so important to be having these conversations about the ethics. Right. Because there's this kind of, oh, wow, these algorithms can do all these amazing things.
Yeah.
But we need to be thinking critically about, what are the ethical implications of that?
Okay, so then having given us this kind of foundation in the technology itself, Koekelberg then really delves into the ethical challenges that AI presents. And he starts by acknowledging that a lot of these problems